In a small kitchen in 1970, when a grandmother whispered these forgotten truths to her grandson, none of us knew they would disappear completely one day. The afternoon sun filtered through the kitchen window of my grandmother's small home on the reservation in 1970, casting warm patterns across the worn linoleum floor. She stood at the counter, her weathered hands working cornmeal into dough for frybread, the same way her mother had taught her, and her mother before that. I sat at the kitchen table doing homework, occasionally glancing up to watch her work. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had performed this task thousands of times, her fingers knowing exactly how much water to add, exactly how long to knead. "You know," she said without looking up, "when I was your age, my grandmother told me the world was changing. She said things wouldn't be the same for us." She paused, dusting flour from her hands. But I don't think even she could have imagined how different things would become. My grandmother was right, though she couldn't have known it then. As she stood in that kitchen in 1970, preparing food the way generations before her had prepared it, living a life not so different from her ancestors despite the presence of electricity and running water, she had no way of knowing what the next 50 years would bring. The changes that were coming, technological, cultural, social, would transform Native American life in ways that would have seemed like pure fantasy to someone standing in that modest reservation kitchen. If you could have told her then about the future her grandchildren and great-grandchildren would inherit, she might not have believed you. Some changes would fill her with pride and joy. Others would puzzle her, make her shake her head in wonder, and some would sadden her in ways she couldn't quite articulate. But all of them would be real, and all of them would come to pass in the span of a single lifetime. The first thing my grandmother never imagined was that some Native American tribes would become wealthy beyond anything she could comprehend. In 1970, poverty on reservations was simply a fact of life. Most families, including ours, struggled to make ends meet. Jobs were scarce, opportunities limited. The idea that any Native community could become prosperous seemed impossible. Yet within 2 decades, some tribes would open casinos on their sovereign land, generating millions and eventually billions of dollars in revenue. Tribes that had been among the poorest communities in America would build resort hotels, golf courses, and entertainment complexes. They would provide health care, education, and housing for their members, create thousands of jobs, and invest in their futures in ways that would have seemed like impossible dreams in 1970. My grandmother would have been amazed to see it, this reversal of fortune for some communities. She would have felt proud, vindicated even, to see Native people succeeding on their own terms, using their sovereignty rights in ways no one had fully explored before. Though she also would have noticed, with her characteristic wisdom, that not all tribes benefited equally, that geography and resources still determined outcomes, that wealth didn't solve every problem. But still, she would have marveled at the transformation, at seeing Native communities with the resources to shape their own destinies. The second thing she never could have predicted was that there would be devices in everyone's pockets that could access all the world's knowledge instantly. In 1970, if you wanted information, you went to a library, asked an elder, or did without. The idea of a small device that could answer any question, show you any place on Earth, connect you with anyone anywhere, it would have sounded like something from a science fiction movie. Yet today, even on remote reservations, young people carry smartphones that give them access to resources my grandmother couldn't have dreamed of. She would have loved this part. I think about how she used to worry about language and traditions being lost because there was no way to preserve them except through memory and practice. If she could have known that one day people would create apps to teach native languages, that videos of traditional songs and dances would be preserved forever online, that young people scattered across the country could connect and share their culture through something called social media, she would have been thrilled. The technology itself might have confused her, but its potential to preserve and share what she held dear would have filled her with hope. The third thing was that Native American actors would star in major Hollywood productions, not as stereotypical sidekicks or villains, but as complex, real characters. In 1970, if you saw a Native person on television or in a movie, They were usually played by a white actor in makeup, speaking in broken English, serving as background to a white hero's story. My grandmother rarely went to movies, but when she did, she noticed these portrayals. She noticed how they never quite captured who her people really were, how they reduced centuries of diverse cultures to a single image of feathered warriors or mystical guides. She would have been proud to see native actors not just appearing in films, but sometimes directing them, writing them, shaping their own narratives. She would have loved seeing movies and television shows where native characters spoke with nuance and authenticity, where their stories were told with respect and complexity. Though I think she might have raised an eyebrow at some of the portrayals, wondering if Hollywood would ever fully understand, she would have recognized this as progress, as a step toward being seen as the multidimensional human beings her people had always been. The fourth surprise would have been that there would be Native American television networks and radio stations broadcasting content created by and for Native communities. In 1970, media was something that happened to Native people, not something they controlled or created. Stories about Native communities were told by outsiders, usually badly. The idea that Native people would have their own media outlets, telling their own stories in their own ways, would have seemed unlikely. She would have appreciated this autonomy, this ability to control the narrative. She might have tuned in to hear traditional music played on the radio, to watch programs about tribal history and culture, to see her grandchildren's generation telling stories that mattered to their communities. She would have understood instinctively why this mattered, why being able to see yourself reflected accurately in media was about more than entertainment. It was about dignity, recognition, and the power to define your own identity. The fifth thing she couldn't have predicted was that traditional Native foods would become trendy in fancy restaurants, with chefs celebrating and elevating dishes that her generation had been made to feel ashamed of. In 1970, Native foods were often viewed as poverty foods, things you ate because you couldn't afford better. The wider American culture showed little interest in indigenous cuisines, and many Native people themselves had internalized the message that their traditional foods were inferior. Yet decades later, upscale restaurants would feature Native American ingredients and cooking techniques. Food critics would write glowing reviews. Cookbooks would celebrate indigenous culinary traditions. Three Sisters gardens, corn, beans, and squash, grown together in traditional symbiotic planting, would be featured in sustainable agriculture movements. Wild rice, bison, and traditional preparations would appear on menus in cities across the country. My grandmother would have shaken her head in bemused wonder at this reversal, pleased that her food traditions were finally being recognized, though perhaps a bit skeptical about whether outsiders truly understood the cultural significance behind the dishes. The sixth surprise would be that many of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren would live in cities far from the reservation, part of a massive urban migration of Native people. In 1970, most Native Americans still lived on or near reservations or in rural Native communities. The idea that within a generation or two, the majority would live in urban areas, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Seattle, Minneapolis, would have been hard to imagine. The reservation was home, the place where community and culture lived, where you belonged. She would have had complicated feelings about this dispersal. Pride that her descendants had opportunities she never had, sadness that they lived so far away, worry about how they would maintain their connection to their culture and community when separated by hundreds or thousands of miles. She would have wondered if living in cities would cause them to lose something essential about who they were. But she also would have understood why they left for education, for jobs, for opportunities that simply didn't exist on the reservation. And she might have been surprised and pleased to see how urban Native communities formed, how people found ways to maintain their identity and traditions, even in cities, creating new forms of community, far from their ancestral lands. The seventh thing was that there would be Native American colleges and universities, institutions of higher education designed by and for Native students. In 1970, few people from our reservation attended college at all, and those who did often found themselves isolated in predominantly white institutions that had little understanding of or support for Native students. The idea of tribal colleges, places where Native students could get a quality education while remaining connected to their cultures and communities, would have seemed wonderfully idealistic, but probably impractical. My grandmother, who never had the opportunity for formal education beyond elementary school, would have been deeply moved by this development. She valued learning highly and would have loved seeing her people create educational institutions that honored both traditional knowledge and contemporary academic skills. She would have been proud to see her great-grandchildren walking across stages at graduation ceremonies, receiving degrees from institutions that respected who they were and where they came from. The eighth surprise would be the rise of the powwow circuit, with Native people traveling across the country to attend large intertribal gatherings that celebrated dance, music, and culture. In 1970, traditional gatherings existed, but they were smaller, more local affairs. The idea of massive powwows drawing thousands of people from different tribes, with competitive dancing, drum competitions, and vendors selling crafts and food, was just beginning to emerge as a phenomenon. She would have loved the powwows, I think. The celebration of culture, the bringing together of different tribal nations, the way young people could learn dances and songs, the beauty of the regalia, the sound of drums echoing across fairgrounds, all of this would have filled her with joy. She might have worried a bit about whether these large commercial gatherings were too different from traditional ceremonies, whether something was being lost in translation, but overall she would have seen them as a positive development, a way for people to celebrate their heritage proudly and publicly. The ninth thing she never imagined was that people from all backgrounds would become interested in Native spirituality and wisdom, seeking out teachings about connection to earth, sustainable living, and holistic approaches to life. In 1970, mainstream American culture generally dismissed Native spiritual practices and worldviews as primitive or irrelevant. The idea that future generations would look to indigenous wisdom for guidance on environmental issues, community building, and meaningful living would have been surprising. This one would have given her mixed feelings. On one hand, she would have been gratified that the wisdom her people had maintained for generations was finally being recognized as valuable. On the other hand, she would have been skeptical about whether outsiders truly understood these teachings, whether they were taking them seriously or just romanticizing them, whether they were respecting the cultural context or just cherry-picking ideas that appealed to them. She would have worried about her people's spiritual practices being commodified or appropriated, turned into products to be bought and sold. But she would have hoped that maybe, just maybe, some good could come from this interest, that some people might genuinely learn and benefit from indigenous perspectives. The 10th surprise would be that young Native people would become activists and advocates on a scale she never saw in her time, organizing movements, making their voices heard on national and international stages, using modern tools to fight for their rights and their futures. In 1970, activism existed, but it was often dangerous, always marginalized, rarely successful in the ways activists hoped. The idea that young Native people would lead movements that captured global attention, that they would use social media to organize and amplify their messages, that they would be interviewed on major news programs and speak at international conferences, would have seemed unlikely. She would have been proud of this courage and visibility. She lived in a time when speaking up often meant putting yourself at risk, when visibility could be dangerous. To see her descendants standing up boldly, demanding justice, protecting sacred lands and waters, using their voices without apology, this would have filled her with admiration and hope. She might have worried for their safety, as grandmothers do, but she would have recognized in them the same spirit of resistance and resilience that had allowed her people to survive everything history had thrown at them. The 11th thing was that DNA testing would become common, with people curious about their ancestry submitting samples to learn about their genetic heritage. In 1970, you knew who you were based on family stories, community recognition, and lived experience. The idea of learning your identity from a test tube would have seemed strange, almost absurd. Yet by the 2000s, genetic testing would become a billion-dollar industry, with millions of people seeking scientific confirmation of their family stories. This development would have puzzled my grandmother. She would have wondered why people needed a test to tell them who they were, why scientific validation mattered more than community knowledge and family relationships. She would have been particularly bemused by people who discovered small percentages of Native ancestry through these tests and suddenly began identifying as Native, sometimes with no cultural connection or community ties. She understood identity as something lived and earned, not something you could discover in a laboratory. But she might have appreciated that these tests could help some people reconnect with lost heritage, could answer questions that family stories couldn't fully resolve. The 12th surprise would be the explosion of Native art in galleries and museums, with Native artists commanding high prices and receiving international recognition for their work. In 1970, Native art was often relegated to anthropology museums, treated as artifacts of the past rather than as living, evolving creative expressions. Contemporary Native artists struggled for recognition, their work often dismissed or stereotyped. The idea that Native artists would be celebrated in major galleries, that their work would sell for thousands or even tens of thousands of dollars, that they would be recognized as important contemporary artists rather than just Native artists, would have been hard to imagine. She would have been delighted by this recognition. She knew many talented people in her community, beadworkers, painters, carvers whose skills were remarkable, but who never received much recognition or compensation for their work. To see Native creativity celebrated and valued would have pleased her immensely, though she might have wondered whether the artists who became successful remained connected to their communities, whether their art still carried cultural meaning or had become just another commodity in the art market. The 13th thing she couldn't have predicted was that her great-grandchildren would be able to video call with family members anywhere in the world, seeing and hearing them in real time, despite being separated by thousands of miles. In 1970, long-distance phone calls were expensive luxuries, often reserved for emergencies or special occasions. Seeing someone's face while talking to them if they weren't in the same room was pure science fiction. The idea that future generations would carry devices in their pockets that could let them not just talk to, but see anyone, anywhere, anytime, would have seemed magical. This technology would have amazed her, particularly thinking about how it could keep families connected despite distance. She worried constantly about family members who moved away, about maintaining relationships across miles, about grandchildren growing up far from home and losing their connections. If she could have known that technology would one day make it possible to stay closely connected despite distance, that grandchildren living in cities could video call home to see her face and hear her voice anytime they wanted, she would have seen this as a wonderful gift, a way to maintain the family bonds that meant everything to her. The 14th surprise would be that traditional Native languages, which seemed destined to disappear entirely, would see revival efforts with young people choosing to learn their ancestral languages and pass them on to their children. In 1970, language loss seemed inevitable. Children were speaking primarily English, elders were passing away, and the number of fluent speakers was declining rapidly. The idea that the trend would reverse, that young people would seek out language learning opportunities, that communities would create immersion programs and teaching resources, would have seemed too optimistic. This would have been perhaps the development that would have brought her the most hope and joy. She mourned the loss of language deeply, understood viscerally what was being lost when people could no longer speak their ancestral tongues. To know that future generations would fight to reclaim these languages, would choose to learn them even though it was difficult, would pass them on to their children, this would have felt like a miracle to her. It wouldn't erase the loss of an entire generation of speakers, but it would mean that the languages might survive, that her great-great-grandchildren might one day speak the words her grandmother spoke. The 15th thing was that environmental concerns would become central to global conversations, with indigenous knowledge about sustainable living and land stewardship finally being recognized as valuable. In 1970, The environmental movement was just beginning, and indigenous perspectives on environmental issues were largely ignored. The idea that someday, scientists and policymakers would seek out indigenous knowledge about ecology, climate, and sustainable resource management would have seemed unlikely. She would have appreciated this recognition, though she might have pointed out wryly that her people had been saying these things all along about the importance of protecting water, respecting the land, thinking about the impact of actions on future generations. She would have been pleased that indigenous environmental knowledge was finally being valued, but she would have wondered if it was too late, if the damage to the earth had already gone too far. Still, she would have been glad that her people's understanding of their relationship with the land was finally being heard. The 16th surprise would be that there would be Native American restaurants and food trucks in cities across the country, with non-Native people seeking out indigenous cuisine. In 1970, you ate Native food at home or at community gatherings, period. The idea of restaurants serving traditional Native dishes to a broader public, of Native chefs becoming celebrated figures in the culinary world, of food trucks serving frybread, tacos, and bison burgers, would have been completely unexpected. She would have found this both amusing and gratifying. Amusing because she remembered when Native food was considered inferior, when serving traditional dishes to non-Native guests might have caused embarrassment. Gratifying because she took pride in her cooking and her food traditions, and she would have loved seeing these foods recognized as delicious and worthy of celebration. Though she might have had opinions about whether restaurant versions lived up to the home-cooked meals she remembered, she would have been pleased overall to see this aspect of Native culture being shared and appreciated. The 17th thing she couldn't have imagined was that her great-grandchildren would have friends and connections all over the world, people from different cultures and backgrounds who they'd never met in person but felt close to because of online communities. In 1970, your community was the people you saw regularly, family, neighbors, people in your town or on your reservation. The idea of meaningful relationships with people you'd never physically met, who lived on different continents, would have been bizarre. This global connection would have fascinated her while also perhaps making her a bit uncomfortable. She valued deep, face-to-face relationships, the kind that developed over time through shared experiences and physical presence. The idea of friendship without physical proximity would have seemed strange, perhaps shallow. But she might have appreciated that these connections allowed Native people to build networks of solidarity across tribal and national boundaries, to share ideas and strategies, to know they weren't alone in their experiences and challenges. The 18th and final thing she never imagined was that so many of the traditions and practices she worried were being lost forever would see renewed interest from younger generations, who would actively seek to learn and revive cultural practices their parents' generation had let slip away. In 1970, it seemed like each generation was moving further from traditional ways, becoming more assimilated, less connected to their cultural roots. The idea that this trend would reverse, that young people would become passionate about cultural preservation and revival, would have seemed optimistic to the point of fantasy. This would have been the development that would have meant the most to her. All her worries about traditions being lost, about young people not caring, about their culture fading away to know that her great-grandchildren and beyond would choose to reconnect, would fight to preserve and revive what had been slipping away, would feel proud rather than ashamed of their heritage. This would have filled her with profound hope and joy. It wouldn't undo the losses, wouldn't bring back everything that had disappeared, but it would mean that the chain wasn't completely broken, that enough remained to rebuild from, that her people's culture would continue, evolving but still recognizably themselves. Standing in that kitchen in 1970, working dough with hands that knew their work by feel and instinct, my grandmother couldn't have predicted any of these changes. She worried about the future, as people always do, but she couldn't have imagined how dramatically different that future would be from her present. Some changes would have delighted her, some would have concerned her, some would have simply amazed her. But through all of it, I think she would have recognized that her people were doing what they had always done, adapting, surviving, finding ways to maintain their identity and dignity, despite overwhelming pressure to disappear or conform. If I could go back to that afternoon in 1970 and tell her about everything that was coming, I think she would have listened quietly, the way she always did when people told her things, taking it all in before responding. And then she might have smiled slightly, that small smile that meant she was both amused and knowing, and she might have said something like, "Well, we've survived everything else that's come our way. I suppose we'll figure out how to survive this too." And she would have been right. Her people, my people, have continued to survive, to adapt, to maintain their identity despite everything. Not perfectly, not without loss and struggle, but with resilience and determination. The world she knew in 1970 has changed beyond recognition. But the core of who her people are, that community connection, that relationship with land and tradition, that ability to endure and adapt that remains. The frybread she was making that afternoon was delicious, as her frybread always was. I can still taste it if I close my eyes and remember. Crispy on the outside, soft and tender inside, perfect with butter and honey. It was a simple thing, that frybread, made from basic ingredients in a modest kitchen, but it connected us to generations before us who had made the same simple food, and it would connect to generations after us who would continue making it. Some things change, but some things endure. My grandmother understood that truth in her bones, even if she couldn't have predicted all the specific ways the world would transform.